Well, we're going to move into the second half of our event now. We've got a great panel here. You all have their bios, so I won't go into great detail, but just very briefly. Next to me, we have Richard Bush, who is the Chen-Fu and Cecilia Yun Co-Chair in Taiwan Studies here at Brookings. Next to Richard, Lynn Kwok, who's a Senior Research Fellow at the University of Cambridge and an Associate Fellow at the International Institute of Strategic Studies. Evans Revere, a non-resident Senior Fellow here at Brookings and Senior Director at the Albright Stonebridge Group. And next to him on the end, we have Jonathan Stromseth, who's the Lee Kuan Yew Chair for Southeast Asian Studies here at Brookings. As Bruce mentioned at the beginning, the point of today's discussion is to talk about a new series of papers that have just been published as part of our Global China project. And these papers really explore China's strategy and relationships in East Asia. Each of the panelists here today has written a paper for this part of the project, exploring different aspects of Beijing's relationships in its own neighborhood. We're going to talk today about some of the common themes that emerge from those papers. I would encourage you all, although you're going to get the highlights in this conversation, to nonetheless go to the website, check out the actual papers themselves. There's a lot of really rich analysis there that you'll enjoy. So to start, I'm going to ask each of the scholars to open just with a couple of minutes of the highlights of the analysis in their papers. We're then going to have a bit of a moderated discussion between us, and then I'll turn it over to the audience for some questions before we wrap up. So Richard, maybe I can start with you.
Okay, thank you very much. 5 points. First of all, Taiwan faces an existential challenge because the People's Republic of China wishes to transform the status quo of Taiwan's existence by making it a special administrative region similar to Hong Kong and Macau. And we know how well Hong Kong's going. Second, from 1979 on, Beijing hoped that it could convince Taiwan's leaders to agree to one country, two systems through persuasion, that if they just talked long enough and demonstrated to Taiwan leaders the advantages to Taiwan, that sooner or later Taiwan would come around. I think that Taiwan's democratization called that strategy into question. And China felt that it had to deal with what it saw as pursuit of Taiwan independence by Li Donghui and Chen Shui-bian. But coming to the third point, the situation stabilized from 2008 onwards. Both President Ma Ying-jeou and President Tsai Ing-wen have sought to reassure Beijing about its intentions. Ma did so in a flexible way, Tsai Ing-wen in a skeptical way. Beijing was willing to take Ma's assurance, but it is in turn skeptical about Tsai's intentions. But even when Ma was in office, Beijing didn't make much progress on its unification objective. Fourth point, I think at this point, and objectively, persuasion has not worked. So consequently, since Tsai Ing-wen came into office, it has pursued another course. And this is not military action, but to use intimidation, pressure, isolation, interference in Taiwan's affairs, and so on. In my view, this coercion without violence is a just right way to cope with Taiwan's refusal to move towards unification. This approach targets the self-confidence of Taiwan's population. And if people in Taiwan lose confidence in the ability to withstand the China challenge, then China wins. If Taiwan's leaders and citizens are divided on what to do, China wins. Now, we have an election coming up in a little more than a month. I think that if Tsai Ing-wen wins that election, coercion without violence will continue. If the KMT candidate Han Kuo-yu, the mayor of Kaohsiung, wins, I There may be a period early on when Beijing tests out a return to persuasion. But even under a President Han, I think that there will be pressure on Han to move quickly to political talks and to sort of making more progress on China's goal. And we'll see how that works out. So thank you.
Great. Thanks very much, Richard. Lynn, Jonathan, you both wrote on Southeast Asia related issues. So I'm going to turn to you two next, perhaps Lynn, and then Jonathan to outline some of the highlights of your papers.
Thanks so much. Thank you, Lindsay. And I'd also like to thank Brookings Institution for the opportunity to be here today. I think the Global China Project is incredibly important in today's context, so I'm very pleased to be a part of it. So my paper dealt with the South China Sea, and my broad argument was that China's role in the South China Sea has largely been a negative one. Insofar as it has sought to consolidate its, in seeking to consolidate its maritime and territorial claims, China has undermined international law, as well as acted to coerce and intimidate its neighbors. As you all know, China began its aggressive consolidation of its territorial claims in December 2013 in the South China Sea by converting small rocks and reefs into large artificial islands. Since then, things have moved quite quickly. By the end of 2017, China had operational naval and air bases in the South China Sea. By 2018, it was escalating its militarization of these features. Now, China says that it's entitled to do as it likes on its own territory. It repeated that claim in its recent defense white paper. But the truth of the matter is that sovereignty of these features hasn't been decided, and in fact is hotly disputed. And in the case of at least one feature that China has built on, Mischief Reef, a tribunal in the Philippines case against China, which issued its award in 2016, stated very clearly that this feature, Mischief Reef, which China has built on, lies within the Philippines' exclusive economic zone, is a low tide feature that lies within the Philippines' exclusive economic zone, and therefore comes clearly within Philippines' jurisdiction and control. So what's China doing, building on this feature and claiming that it's entitled to do as it likes on its own territory? So that's China's territorial claims, territorial claim attempts, and how they have undermined international law. How about its attempts to strengthen its maritime claims and control around features? This has taken several forms. So first, China has encroached on coastal states, exclusive economic zones, and this completely flies in the face of the tribunal's ruling, because this ruling made clear that insofar as China was claiming economic rights to its 9-dash line, no go. It simply has no rights from the 9-dash line. And also that none of the features in the Spratly Islands in the South China Sea actually are entitled to a 200 nautical mile exclusive economic zone. In other words, China should not be encroaching on its neighbors' exclusive economic zone. Second, China has also increased its presence around territories occupied by its neighbors. So in the first half of this year, China sent hundreds of vessels to swarm the area around Philippines-occupied T2 Island. And third, China has persisted in objecting to the US and other allies' naval vessels plying and asserting valid maritime rights and freedoms in the South China Sea. And this is in direct contravention of the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. Now, China has repeatedly insisted that the situation in the South China Sea is calm and that the region is in harmony. This should be exposed for what it is. It's a pure fallacy. The region is calm and so-called calm and stable because countries are now resigning themselves to what they see they must resign themselves to, namely a situation where might triumphs over right. And so I would argue that an erosion of rules-based order in the region matters to everyone in the international community, including here in the United States, because when the rule of law is undermined in one place, it's undermined everywhere. It undermines peace and stability in the region. And certainly this should concern not only the countries who live in the shadow of this bear moth, but also here in the United States. And in the context of the US-China rivalry, I think we should all be concerned because perhaps the only thing that is keeping it from becoming a hot conflict is that countries decide to compete within the parameters of international law. And I think that's what we should all be doing as an international community. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Lynn. Jonathan.
Yes. Well, it's great to be here, and thank everybody for coming. I've had a great opportunity to live many, many years of my life in both China and Southeast Asia over the past 20-odd years. And during that time, I always noticed that Southeast Asian countries and friends and leaders and all of that, were very aware of China's presence, the great, power to the north. China, not so much in terms of looking south towards Southeast Asia. And what I've really noticed in the last 5 or 6 years as I come and go from Beijing is a rising interest in that particular region. And this isn't an accident. I think what we're seeing is a new sort of, I wouldn't call it a grand strategy so much as a foreign policy orientation, where shaping the surrounding region or neighborhood diplomacy is becoming more and more important to China's broader strategy, and they themselves see it as a platform for their rise more generally. I also see, and this is the title of my paper, that they see Southeast Asia to some extent as a testing ground for practicing the ways of becoming a great power in a region that is full of small and medium powers or very large countries demographically like Indonesia. In terms of the toolkit that they're using in the region, you can see both soft power and hard power elements. And the soft power elements sometimes have a hard edge. But the soft power elements, I would say, really focuses on economic statecraft in particular, and the Belt and Road Initiative specifically. If you look at projects that are both under planning and also projects that are already underway, China has a commitment of something like $250 billion to the region. This is especially true in mainland Southeast Asia, and the Mekong region in particular. There has been unease and pushback from the region, but I think the last year in particular, we've really seen an example of how Southeast Asian countries, Malaysia and others, are basically learning how to negotiate better on China. They're renegotiating contracts. China's also learning from its mistakes in implementation. And I think you see a kind of mutual learning dynamic going on in the region that is likely to make the Belt and Road Initiative or the varied projects that are part of it more enduring and sustainable over the long term. Now, of course, the hard power, as well stated by Lynn, is primarily seen and illustrated in the South China Sea and the land reclamation and the building of artificial islands and so on. But what I've noticed when I go to the region most recently is a kind of thinking that maybe we focus so much on the land that we forgot, so much on the sea that we forgot about the land. That isn't to say that both aren't really important, and they're inextricably intertwined. But you definitely see, I think, China beginning to achieve its strategic goals in the region through economic statecraft, and actually even influence, of course, the position of key ASEAN partners like Cambodia and Laos on the more strategic South China Sea issues. Now, let me just kind of sum up. I think the conventional wisdom is that China will one day come to dominate this region. And my answer to that is, well, it's not preordained, and it depends. What does it depend on? First of all, the countries of Southeast Asia obviously have agency themselves. They're going to respond in different ways depending on geographic proximity, the opportunities they see with China economically, threat perceptions, history, and so on. When you look at Vietnam, it's right on the front line on the South China Sea, but it also is receiving a lot of investment from China. It's engaging China. My sense of Vietnam is that it's trying to balance against China without provoking it. It's a delicate and careful game they have to play. And we see relations with the United States, Japan, and India really taking off as part of that broader balancing strategy. Also Indonesia, which I discuss in the paper, maybe we can discuss more during the Q&A, has had a long-standing game of balancing major powers, and it's really taking advantage of the Belt and Road Initiative for its own economic interests. Finally, I would just say that China faces what I think of as tripwires in the region. One thing that I'm following and tracking and quite concerned about at the current time is China's effort to sort of re-engage with the overseas Chinese or the Chinese diaspora in Southeast Asia, which is a shift in long-standing policy that began with Zhou Enlai to help be a bridge for implementing, for instance, the Belt and Road projects or realizing a broader Chinese dream of some sort. And I think this is something that should be watched carefully, and China has to be very measured and careful, or it could sort of lead to a backlash in Indonesia and other countries that I think could really cause problems for it in the future. Thanks.
Great, thanks, Jonathan. And Evans, last but not least, because we saved the spiciest topic for last, you've written a paper on North Korea.
Yes, always an interesting and often depressing subject. First of all, thank you all for being here today. It's not often that I come down from my mountaintop exile in New Jersey to Washington, so it's a special delight to be here, particularly in this very important occasion. And once again, thank you all for being here. North Korea obviously remains one of the most important dimensions of Chinese foreign policy. And it's also, of course, a very critical factor in China-US relations. And I think the memory of what happened in 2017 is all still very much with us when, as the United States and North Korea seemed to be approaching a possible military confrontation, not only did US-North Korea relations go up to the brink, but as I argue in the paper, so did China-North Korea relations for some interesting overlapping reasons. The Chinese were deeply concerned that North Korean actions, North Korean provocations, North Korean nuclear and long-range ballistic missile testing were creating the conditions for a possible military confrontation on its border. Beijing was not happy, predictably. They retaliated in very interesting ways, directly and indirectly, including rhetorically increasing their support for cooperation with the United States on the Korean Peninsula, but more practically throwing their weight behind some very important and unprecedented international sanctions that were applied on North Korea during 2017. But then, of course, as you'll remember, early in 2018, something changed. An outburst of very interesting and unprecedented diplomacy on the Korean Peninsula left Seoul and Washington in the driver's seat when it came to relations with North Korea. And meanwhile, the Chinese were sitting there a bit nonplussed, wondering what in heaven's name just happened. A senior Chinese official told us in Beijing that there were real concerns that North Korea was, quote, drifting out of our orbit, unquote. There were also concerns uttered by Chinese officials that the Chinese were concerned about the possibility that North Korea would start to cut its own deals with the United States and North Korea without reference to China's interests. Once again, not a very happy thing if you're a Chinese official. The upshot of all this is that China went into a diplomatic overdrive. 5 summits between Kim Jong-un and Xi Jinping, 3 of them within a 100-day period. Think about that, almost unprecedented diplomatic outreach. The Chinese were determined to do what I called implement the 5 R's. Repair, refurbish, renormalize relations with North Korea, as well as reestablish their influence in Pyongyang, and also remind South Korea and the United States and North Korea that China has interests on the Korean Peninsula and was prepared to do what was necessary to make sure that others understood what those interests were. The upshot for the United States, as I mentioned in the paper, is that denuclearization for the Chinese has always been a second or third priority when it comes to North Korea. The rhetoric is always there, and you're all familiar with it. But the reality is that the Chinese have always been focused on maintaining stability and predictability with respect to their next-door neighbor, mostly out of concern that the North Koreans could, as they almost did in 2017, create a major crisis or even a war. I argue in my paper, including some interesting quotes from unnamed officials, that priority for denuclearization has now slipped. The Chinese have moved closer to the direction of not so much acknowledging North Korea as a permanent nuclear power or nuclear weapon state, but realizing that denuclearization is almost certainly not going to happen, and therefore China is going to have to learn to live with, however reluctant they may be about doing that, live with a nuclear-armed North Korea, probably in perpetuity. Meanwhile, the other upshot for the United States is that because of a deteriorating U.S.-China relationship, the high watermark of U.S.-China cooperation on North Korea has long since passed. It passed in late 2017. We will be very hard-pressed to elicit Chinese cooperation in the future in pushing North Korea, in pressing North Korea, and in imposing additional sanctions, especially in the United Nations Security Council on North Korea. As a Chinese colleague said to me a few months ago, we are no longer going to be doing you Americans any favors on the Korean Peninsula. And then the final upshot is that we can now expect, as a result of this repaired or refurbished China-North Korea relationship, that China and North Korea will make common cause in the months and years to come in a number of very interesting and delicate areas, including efforts to try to weaken the U.S.-South Korea alliance. They will try either individually or collectively to drive wedges between the United States and our security partners in Northeast Asia. Ultimately, they would hope that they might find a way to push the United States off the Korean Peninsula, and also will try to take advantage of a perception in the region of declining U.S. influence, a U.S. abdication of leadership and dominance in the region, and a number of U.S. security alliances that, to put it politely, are not in the best of shape. So let me end there. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks very much. So in the time that we have, three issues that I wanted to talk about. The first is trying to tease out some of the implications I think that you all get at in your papers about what China wants, what its ambitions are in its own neighborhood in East Asia. The second, some of, I guess, the tools in the toolkit that we see Beijing using, because I think there's some interesting commonalities that come out, even though we're talking about different parts of East Asia. And then finally, thinking about the choices and the agency that other East Asian countries have, because we often come at these questions from the China angle, but Jonathan, I think your paper points out very well that we ought to be talking about the strategic choices that other countries are making as well. So starting at the top with the idea of what China wants, we hear a lot of discussion about a China dream, a community of common destiny, which all sounds lovely, but it can be hard to parse out exactly what that means. So Jonathan, I wanted to start with you. Can you just break down for us, in practical terms perhaps, if we're trying to figure out what a community of common destiny actually looks like, and how that might be a different sort of concept for an East Asian security order than what we see today? What practical changes do you think countries in Southeast Asia would see, for example, based on the activities and some of the strategies that we see China using toward its Southeast Asian neighbors right now?
Boy, that's a tough one. Well, the community of common destiny, as described, really stresses inclusiveness, win-win cooperation. There's speeches that Xi Jinping has given, say, to the Indonesian parliament about a community of common destiny between China and Southeast Asia in particular. Of course, there are concerns, and I would say suspicions, that it also looks almost like the past, the deep past, and are they trying to create a kind of tributary system of many, many centuries ago? I think that's a little bit overblown, and I do think that China is trying to create some kind of broad narrative that is different from the American narrative for how the region can act together, and somewhat together to the exclusion of external powers like the United States. So that's, I think, sort of the key thing. But I'm not actually all that worried about a community of common destiny, because I don't think it's very actionable at the end of the day. And I do think to some extent, China's more assertive behavior, which may or may not be trying to bring it about, has sort of led to a counter reaction in the region. And so you see, as I mentioned in my presentation, Vietnam definitely sort of diversifying its relations, not just to the United States, but other powers, and other countries in some ways taking advantage for their own purposes of some of the elements of that community for, say, their own economic goals. So I'm kind of maybe just setting the table here, but I'm very much interested to hear now what others have to say on that topic as well.
Great, thanks, Jonathan. Evans, I want to follow up with you here. North Korea is an interesting case, I think, always, but in this specific conversation, because you talk about in your paper that China has looked at its relationship with North Korea as both sort of a buffer in a way, but also a vulnerability. In the United States, we often talk about an advantage that the United States has strategically is that we have these close security alliances and partnerships. China, if anywhere, has tried to have that kind of relationship. It's with North Korea, and yet it's been relatively fraught. So what do you think that tells you in terms of how China will seek to manage security relationships with countries on its own periphery?
Looking around the room, I see some familiar faces, and some of you were in the room, and we had a remarkable exchange with a senior PLA officer, and I asked her the embarrassing question, what is the nature of your military relationship with the DPRK? And in her response, she gave me a long list, she gave all of us a long list of the things that North Korea and China do not do together as allies. It was a remarkable answer. And that tells me that among other things, that the relationship as close as lips and teeth has not been as close as lips and teeth in a long time. For those of you who read my paper, you'll see I actually have some fun talking about the origins of that phrase. But in any event, you used the very interesting word, manage. The Chinese are managing as best they can with an irascible neighbor who often cannot be trusted, cannot be depended on, has nuclear weapons, is almost certainly not going to give them up. And I would suggest that that relationship is really sui generis as you look around the region. There's nobody else that the Chinese have quite that difficult and complicated a relationship with. Look back at 2017, every time Xi Jinping tried to chair a major international meeting, whether it was in Shanghai or Beijing, the North Koreans managed to schedule a nuclear weapons test or missile test to commemorate the fact, driving the Chinese crazy. The North Koreans know that China is their lifeline, but they also know that they have a certain bit of influence in Beijing and they can get away with things. So I don't know that I would use the China-North Korea relationship as the basis for making any assumptions about any other pair of relationships that China has in the region.
Fair, thank you. Moving on to sort of how China manages relationships. Richard, I want to turn to you for a second because we've heard a bit about various sort of tools, economic inducements, coercion. In the Taiwan situation, I think Taiwan is interesting because you can look at it, much like Jonathan said, as sort of this test case for how Beijing may try to wield certain tools of influence. And one that we've certainly seen in the Taiwan case is thinking about how to try to influence domestic political debates, to hopefully see domestic political leaders align more closely with Beijing's perspective. You mentioned that for now, we seem to be in this just right Goldilocks kind of intimidation strategy. But we have an election coming up in Taiwan. Here in the United States, the U.S. and Taiwan relationship at times appears to perhaps be getting closer. Do you have any concerns that Beijing may rethink exactly where it needs to land on this intimidation sort of strategy, and to what degree will it try to work more actively to shape the domestic conversation in Taipei right now?
Well, if it happens that Tsai Ing-wen is reelected, and the polls suggest that she will be, I think it's going to require some degree of reassessment of how well the strategy and tactics worked. And particularly the part about co-optation and trying to sort of create allies within the Taiwan political system. Or did that actually work to Tsai Ing-wen's advantage? I don't know where they're going to come out on that. My guess is that they will double down on what they were doing, what they've been doing, and play for time. But some of the things, at least, that they're doing can be deployed to other places in the region, creating stronger business ties with local business elites, buying up newspapers to project a positive view of China, supporting politicians to their liking. That can be re-exported, I think.
And Lynn, you in the South China Sea case, I mean, some of the things that Richard is discussing here, we see similar kinds of techniques being used in Southeast Asia as well. To what degree, when you look forward in the South China Sea, do you feel like Beijing feels confident about how well some of these perhaps inducements have been working in the South China Sea? I mean, perhaps if you're looking at the Philippines right now, you're feeling okay about where things are. Less so, perhaps, if you're looking at Vietnam. So how well would you assess that, I guess, some of these positive inducements have been working in the South China Sea right now?
Let me first start off by looking not at the state level, but at the population level. And I think what has been really interesting to me as a lawyer working on these issues is how much sway Chinese arguments, and they're not just any arguments, these are Chinese legal arguments. They are making a case on the basis of law. And these arguments play very much of a role in convincing the local populace who, in Southeast Asia, many of whom have a local Chinese community. They have been incredibly persuasive for these people. And even in the case of Hong Kong, when I first heard that Beijing was actually accusing the United States of being this invisible hand on protesters, I just thought, that's absurd. You're insulting the protesters because there's so many of them and they're clearly concerned about real issues that are facing their, I want to say their country, but that would not be the right word. But, well, yes, it might be in the sense. But I thought it was such an impossible argument for China to be seeking to make. But I've heard so many people approach me asking about the Hong Kong issue. And they said, oh, once they heard that the US was involved, or once they read that the US was involved, oh, that explains that. That makes sense now, because otherwise, why would all these protesters be on the streets? It's not in their interest. So they do see the invisible hand of the United States. So I think China has been quite effective in using some of these domestic influence operations in both outside of the South China Sea, but also in relation to the South China Sea as well. Lots of people buy the arguments that China makes on the South China Sea. And in terms of, how confident is is China that, its inducements, its positive inducements in the region have worked. I think China should be quite proud of itself, because if we look at the Philippines has not insisted, has not talked about the award. I mean, it raises it once in a while in a perfunctory way with China, but then moves on. And what the Philippines now is looking forward to and hoping to conclude is a cooperation. They've signed a memorandum of understanding for cooperation on oil and gas development. And the Philippines is looking forward to concluding such a deal with China to cooperate in oil and gas development. I think the Philippines is quite optimistic that it'll get China to agree to a deal that would implicitly recognize China's sovereign rights that would implicitly recognize Philippines' sovereign rights in the Philippines on the exclusive economic zone. But whether China actually agrees to that is a different case altogether. But I think China looking out to the Philippines should be quite reassured. Looking out to Vietnam, I think it shouldn't be too perturbed either, because at one stage, in response to the Chinese survey vessel in the Vietnamese exclusive economic zone, Vietnam sent out the Coast Guard, but at one stage there were reports that it was actually a Vietnamese naval vessel. And when I spoke to Vietnamese officials about this, they poo-pooed that story and said, no way, that would be way too escalatory to send out a naval vessel to protect our waters. So, Vietnam, even though it's the most forward-leaning in a sense of all the South China Sea claimants, Vietnam has been also quite restrained. As Jonathan mentioned earlier, it does not want to provoke China. And one country that we don't talk about often enough is another Southeast Asian claimant in the South China Sea, and that's Malaysia. And I think Malaysia, many thought that under the new Prime Minister Mahathir, that Malaysia would be more, it would be less accommodating towards China, but I haven't seen that at all. And in fact, in some of the statements that some of the officials have made, so for instance, Prime Minister Mahathir has talked about how countries need to maintain an equidistance between China and the United States, as if somehow their acts, at least in the South China Sea, were equivalent. It sort of surprises me a little bit. And so, and then recently we had its Deputy Defense Minister also come out to say that perhaps we shouldn't be talking about Asia-Pacific or Indo-Pacific, we should talk about Asia. But that really just buys into China's narrative of Asia for Asians, as opposed to, a rules-based grouping that all countries should adhere to. So there's some concerning signs if one is concerned about the rule of law. But if I were China, I would be rather happy and patting myself on the back right now, because I think it looks like it's going pretty well. There's some exceptions, of course, and I think U.S. freedom of navigation operations or U.S. assertions of maritime rights and freedoms together with allies and partners, I think that's an important development recently, and we shouldn't take away credit for that. So that's pretty important. But by and large, I think in terms of the long-term trajectory, China, through positive inducements, through coercion, etc., is in quite a happy state.
Well, that's uplifting, but I want to turn it over to questions from the audience. We've got time for a few. So I will start with the gentleman right here in the second row. If you could identify yourself, and I'm going to ask folks in the interest of time to please frame your question as a question and not a comment, please.
Yeah. All right. My name is Charles Tang. I'm the chairman of the Brazil-China Chamber of Commerce, senior fellow of the Center for China and Globalization in Beijing, and a member of the Fernand Braudel Institute of World Economics in São Paulo, Brazil. We've talked a lot about Asia. I'd like to ask the question if what's happening in Latin America, how you see it applying to China's relation with Asia. President Bolsonaro from Brazil was very much against China when he was a candidate. And he was very outspoken about his thoughts, negative thoughts about China. He recently visited China and came back so pleased with China that he says that the Chinese citizens will no longer need a visa to go to Brazil. And he just received 2 weeks ago the Huawei CEO in Brazil in his presidential office. So I wrote an article saying that Latin America and Caribbean are growing a Chinese garden because China is investing massively into the region and helping these countries develop and grow and prosper. Bolsonaro was, of course, very cozying up to President Trump, and he made a love statement to President Trump. But now he's making a love statement to President Xi. So because of Chinese investments that Latin America and the Caribbean desperately need, like the president of Dominican Republic told me, why he needed to have relations with China. Isn't the same thing happening throughout Southeast Asia?
Similarities between Latin America and some of the partnerships China is building there and what we're seeing in East Asia. You want to take this one?
Well, I'll take a first shot at it. I mean, there's certainly similarities. And I mean, if we look at Southeast Asia, the Asian Development Bank estimates that, the region needs to spend 5.7% of its aggregate GDP up till 2013 to tackle poverty, address climate change, and address poverty as well. So there are great development needs in the region. There's great need for infrastructure development. And as a result, I think this gives China, it opens up a role that China can play. And I think that's actually a good thing. I actually think that, development in all regions, not just my own, is important, and I don't think we should be poo-pooing any such offers. But I think what does need to happen is, first, I think there needs to be, complementary options that will actually help ensure that Belt and Road Initiative deals are competitive, transparent, etc. And I think also what needs to happen is. I think part of the reason why there's so much concern over Belt and Road Initiative projects is because, that China's actions in certain other areas or in certain other issues have generated a bad taste in mouths. So something that could conceivably be a wonderful thing in terms of helping countries in the region, in my region and elsewhere, has this shadow of doubt over it because of China's bad behavior in certain other respects. So I would just, start off with that observation.
Thanks, Lynn. I think we have a question right here.
Yes, I think Lynn.
Oh.
I think Lynn, you have.
Oh,
I'm sorry, John Osler. I think Lynn is the solution to this growing sense of competition between the United States and China. It's true, China is going all over the world and investing. But it's also true that the United States invests all over the world. And I think the idea is a cooperative effort by United States and China, and the United States saying, how can we help? Let's get in and help. I can't understand why the United States pulled out of TPP.
It's a good point. Just in the interest of time, is there a question in there?
Yeah, sure. The question is, what are the chances of cooperation between the United States and China in these developing countries?
I could
Okay,
give it.
Jonathan, sure.
Well, one of my great concerns, I stated that I wasn't that concerned about a community of common destiny because I don't think it's particularly actionable. But I am, in fact, very concerned about how China is leveraging economic statecraft and the Belt and Road Initiative to achieve its strategic goals in the region more broadly, and often to the detriment of a U.S. role. But I think we're also shooting ourselves in the foot. As you pointed out, we pulled out of TPP, and we are also, over the last year, we've seen the United States constantly branding China across the world as engaging in predatory economics, debt trap diplomacy. That is actually true in some cases. But what we've seen, as I mentioned, in Southeast Asia is, better negotiation from Southeast Asian countries and moving to sort of engage China, I think, in a tougher, stronger way. Now, if you look at the U.S. side of the equation, the Trump administration has also done some interesting things on the economic side. For instance, about a year ago, they entered into an agreement with Japan, which actually gives more infrastructure financing to Southeast Asia than China, but few people know that. With Japan and Australia to help develop mechanisms and actual projects for high quality, good governance, good environmentally sound infrastructure projects. And I hope that the Trump administration will help to operationalize and accelerate this trilateral cooperation, but not to create a bifurcated region between China on the one hand and the US and its like-minded partners on the other. I'd like to see them succeed in that effort and then re-engage China from a position of strength.
Okay, we've got one last question, and I'm going to go to the gentleman in the back there. Yes, sir. If we could.
Thank you very much for a very good presentation. I'm Elliot Hurwitz. I'm retired. There's been a great deal. The panel discussed very extensively the role of the PRC in the South China Sea and the parameters of international law. Would anyone like to discuss the fact that the U.S. is not a signatory to the law of the sea?
Maybe the lawyer could let us know.
We are not. Lynn, do you want to take this one? It is a legal question.
As a Southeast Asian.
Sure. Yeah.
I think the short answer to your question, and it's a valid one, is that even though the United States has not acceded to the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, it adheres to the principles set out therein as a matter of customary international law. So that's like the direct response to your question. But really what I would like to add to that is also my own question, which is why hasn't the United States acceded to the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea? Because I think it makes eminent sense. It would take away a large criticism that China has validly leveled towards the United States, namely that it's hypocritical of the United States to expect adherence to a convention that the United States itself has not acceded to. So I think it makes every sense that the United States should do it. So if anyone can tell me why it hasn't done it so far, that's an actual sensible response, and I would be very, very pleased. Thank you.
The answer to the question, and to many questions, is the U.S. Senate. Yeah.
60 votes in the U.S.
precise.
Senate.
Yeah.
We'd like that for many things. We'll leave it there. Thank you all very much for joining us today.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe for more videos from Brookings.